Sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to one person brave enough to speak the truth that everyone else chooses to ignore. The marble floor beneath Marcus Thompson's Italian leather shoes felt cold and unforgiving as he clutched his chest, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The towering glass windows of his penthouse office reflected the storm clouds gathering over downtown Seattle, while the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed to grow louder with each labored heartbeat. "Sir, are you all right?" The voice belonged to Dorothy Williams, a 73-year-old woman whose weathered hands gripped her mop handle like an anchor in turbulent waters. Her dark eyes, sharp despite her age, took in the scene with an intensity that made the billionaire's personal assistant look up from her phone for the first time all morning. "I'm fine," Marcus snapped, straightening his 6-foot frame and adjusting his silver tie with trembling fingers. But Dorothy had seen those same tremors 3 times this week, noticed how his usually commanding voice had developed a slight wheeze, observed the way he pressed his palm against his chest when he thought no one was watching. She'd been cleaning these executive floors for 15 years, invisible to most, but her eyes missed nothing. Dorothy Williams had arrived at the Thompson Industries building at 4:30 that morning, just as she had every weekday for the past decade and a half. The security guards barely glanced up as she swiped her worn ID badge, her reflection caught momentarily in the polished brass of the elevator doors. At 73, she moved with the measured pace of someone who understood that steady persistence outlasted youthful speed. Her uniform, a simple navy blue dress with the company logo embroidered on the pocket, had been washed so many times the fabric felt soft as cotton against her dark skin. The 42nd floor housed the executive offices, a realm of mahogany desks, crystal awards, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view most people would never experience. Dorothy knew every corner of this world, every hidden coffee stain on expensive carpets, every fingerprint on glass tables that cost more than most people's cars. She'd raised 4 children on the salary from this job, put 2 through college, and helped her youngest daughter buy her first home. The work was honest, the pay modest but steady, and she took pride in keeping these spaces spotless. But Dorothy noticed things others didn't. She'd grown up in rural Alabama, the daughter of a woman who cleaned houses for wealthy white families, and her mother had taught her an invaluable skill: how to read people when they thought no one was watching. "You see the truth in the quiet moments," her mother used to say. "When folks think they're alone, that's when their real selves show." Marcus Thompson, at 58, was everything Dorothy wasn't supposed to notice. The CEO and majority shareholder of Thompson Industries commanded respect through his presence alone. His salt and pepper hair was always perfectly styled, his suits hand-tailored in London, his voice the kind that could silence a boardroom or inspire stockholders. He built his empire from a small tech startup in his garage, and now his company employed over 30,000 people worldwide. Forbes magazine had featured him on 3 covers, and his philanthropic foundation had donated millions to education and healthcare initiatives. Yet for the past month, Dorothy had watched him differently. She'd seen him pause at the top of the stairs, one hand gripping the railing while he caught his breath. She'd noticed how he'd started taking the elevator instead of walking up 2 flights to the helipad. Most telling of all, she'd observed the way he rubbed his left arm during long meetings, a gesture so subtle that even his closest advisors missed it. The morning's incident wasn't the first warning sign Dorothy had witnessed, but it was the most alarming. As she continued her cleaning routine, she couldn't shake the image of Marcus's pale complexion, the way sweat had beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of his office. She'd seen these signs before 23 years ago, when her husband Samuel had his first heart attack. The doctors had said if she'd brought him in just 2 hours later, he wouldn't have survived. Marcus's personal assistant, Jessica, was a 28-year-old woman who'd graduated from Stanford with honors and spoke 4 languages fluently. She managed his calendar with military precision, fielded calls from senators and foreign ministers, and could arrange a meeting with almost anyone in the world within 48 hours. But she lived her life through screens and schedules, rarely lifting her eyes from her phone or laptop long enough to truly see the man she worked for. "Dorothy, make sure you clean the conference table thoroughly," Jessica instructed without looking up from her device. "Mr. Thompson has the board meeting at 10, and then the Japanese investors at noon." Her voice carried the casual authority of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, never worried about whether her paycheck would cover her rent and groceries in the same month. "Yes, miss," Dorothy replied, her voice steady despite the concern gnawing at her chest. She tried to speak up once before, 3 weeks ago, mentioning to Jessica that Mr. Thompson seemed tired lately. Jessica had smiled politely and suggested Dorothy focus on her cleaning duties rather than the executive's health. The dismissal had stung, but Dorothy understood the unspoken message: know your place. The conference room gleamed under the soft LED lighting, its 20-foot table reflecting the Seattle skyline like a dark mirror. Dorothy worked methodically, polishing each chair, ensuring every water glass sparkled. Through the glass walls, she could see Marcus in his office, speaking animatedly on the phone while pacing back and forth. Even from a distance, she noticed the slight favor he gave his left side, the way he kept his right hand free to steady himself against his desk. At 9:15, the board members began arriving. Dorothy recognized each of them by now: Patricia Morrison, the sharp-eyed CFO who always wore red lipstick and carried herself like a general; Robert Jenkins, the head of operations whose laugh boomed through the halls but whose eyes remained calculating; and David Park, the youngest board member at 42, whose innovative marketing strategies had doubled the company's market share in 3 years. They filed into the conference room with the confidence of people accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives and millions of dollars. Dorothy finished her work and retreated to the supply closet, but she left the door slightly ajar. Something in her gut told her to stay close, the same instinct that had saved her grandson from walking into traffic when he was 3, the same feeling that had made her insist her daughter get a second opinion when the first doctor dismissed her breast cancer symptoms as stress. The meeting began promptly at 10 o'clock. Marcus took his position at the head of the table, his voice strong and authoritative as he reviewed the quarterly reports. But Dorothy could see what the others couldn't: the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table, the shallow quality of his breathing between sentences, the fine sheen of perspiration that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. 20 minutes into the presentation, Marcus paused mid-sentence. His face had gone ashen, and his left hand moved instinctively to his chest. "As I was saying," he continued, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. Patricia Morrison looked up from her notes, a frown creasing her brow, but she attributed his hesitation to the complexity of the financial data they were discussing. Dorothy's heart began to race. She'd seen this exact sequence before: the way her husband had tried to push through his symptoms, the stubborn pride that refused to acknowledge weakness. She watched as Marcus reached for his water glass with a hand that trembled just enough to send tiny ripples across the surface. The Japanese investors arrived at 11:45, 20 minutes ahead of schedule. Dorothy watched from her position near the elevators as the delegation was escorted to the executive waiting area. They spoke in hushed tones among themselves, occasionally glancing toward Marcus's office where he was wrapping up the board meeting. These men represented a potential $200 million partnership, the kind of deal that could secure Thompson Industries' expansion into Asian markets for the next decade. Marcus emerged from the conference room, his smile bright and welcoming despite the pallor that had settled over his features. He shook hands with each board member, his grip firm and confident, giving no outward sign of distress. But Dorothy saw the way he leaned slightly against the doorframe when he thought no one was looking, the careful way he moved as if sudden motions might trigger something he couldn't control. "Gentlemen," Marcus greeted the Japanese delegation, his voice warm and professional. "Welcome to Thompson Industries. I trust your flight was comfortable." His public persona was flawless, the practiced charm of someone who'd spent decades in high-stakes negotiations. But Dorothy noticed the way he kept his left elbow pressed close to his side, the subtle shift in his posture that spoke of discomfort he was determined to hide. The meeting moved to the main conference room, and Dorothy positioned herself in the adjacent office, ostensibly organizing supplies while keeping one eye on the proceedings. Through the glass walls, she could see Marcus gesturing enthusiastically as he outlined his vision for the partnership. His passion for his work was genuine, the fire that had driven him from a small-town kid with big dreams to one of the most influential business leaders in the country. But passion couldn't overcome physiology. Dorothy watched as Marcus's complexion grew paler with each passing minute. His sentences, usually crisp and decisive, began to trail off in ways that made the interpreters exchange concerned glances. Most troubling of all, she saw him press his left hand against his chest 3 times during a single 5-minute period, each gesture so brief that anyone not specifically watching for it would miss it entirely. At 12:25, Marcus excused himself for a moment, claiming he needed to retrieve some additional documents from his office. Dorothy saw him walk slowly down the hall, no longer maintaining the brisk pace that usually characterized his movements. When he reached his office door, he paused, one hand on the frame, and took 3 deep breaths before stepping inside. That's when Dorothy made her decision. She abandoned her supply cart and walked purposefully toward Marcus's office, her worn shoes silent on the plush carpet. She'd spent 15 years being invisible, 15 years watching the powerful make decisions while she cleaned up after them. But some things transcended social hierarchies, and she'd be damned if she let this man die from pride and stubbornness. She knocked softly on the door and entered without waiting for permission. Marcus was seated behind his massive desk, both hands pressed flat against the surface as if anchoring himself to something solid. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and sweat had beaded along his hairline despite the cool temperature of the room. "Mr. Thompson," Dorothy said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd raised 4 children and nursed a husband through 2 heart attacks. "You need medical attention right now." Marcus looked up, surprise and irritation flickering across his features. "Dorothy, I appreciate your concern, but I'm in the middle of crucial negotiations. Please return to your duties." His words were measured, but she could hear the strain beneath them, the effort it took to maintain his composure. "Sir, with all due respect, I've seen these signs before. My husband had them 23 years ago. You're having cardiac symptoms, and they're getting worse." Dorothy stepped closer, her dark eyes meeting his with unwavering directness. "Those investors will understand if you need medical attention, but they won't understand if you collapse during their presentation." For a moment, the powerful CEO and the elderly janitor faced each other across a divide that went far beyond their respective positions in the company hierarchy. Marcus's instinct was to dismiss her concerns, to reassert his authority and send her back to her cleaning. He had a reputation to maintain, shareholders to satisfy, a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars hanging in the balance. But something in Dorothy's expression stopped him. There was no deference in her gaze, no attempt to soften her words to spare his ego. This was the look of someone who'd seen enough of life to recognize what truly mattered, who understood that all the money and power in the world meant nothing if you weren't alive to enjoy them. "I feel fine," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Even as he spoke, his left hand moved unconsciously to his chest, betraying the words before they were fully formed. Dorothy stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Thompson, my Samuel was 56 when he had his first attack. Strong as an ox, proud as a peacock, stubborn as a mule. He insisted on finishing his shift at the factory, told me it was just indigestion from the chili I'd made for lunch. By the time I got him to the hospital, the damage was already done. He lived another 15 years, but he was never the same." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of traffic 42 stories below. Marcus studied Dorothy's face, seeing her clearly perhaps for the first time in their 15-year acquaintance. This wasn't the invisible cleaning woman who'd always been part of the building's background. This was a person with her own history, her own losses, her own hard-earned wisdom. "The investors," Marcus began weakly. "Will reschedule," Dorothy finished firmly. "But you can't reschedule your life, sir. And right now, that's what's at stake." As if summoned by her words, another wave of pain washed over Marcus, this one stronger than the previous episodes. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white with the effort of maintaining control. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and for a moment, he wondered if Dorothy might be right. "What do you think I should do?" The question surprised them both. Marcus Thompson, who made split-second decisions involving millions of dollars, who'd been profiled as one of America's most decisive leaders, was asking a janitor for advice about his own health. Dorothy didn't hesitate. "I think you should let me call 911 right now. And I think you should be honest with Jessica about what's happening so she can handle the investors appropriately." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "And I think you should stop trying to carry the whole world on your shoulders long enough to take care of the one body you've got." The wisdom in her words cut through his resistance like a blade through silk. Marcus had spent his entire adult life believing that showing weakness was tantamount to failure, that admitting vulnerability would somehow diminish his authority. But sitting in his office, struggling to breathe normally while a woman old enough to be his mother offered him guidance born from painful experience, he realized how foolish that belief had been. "All right," he said quietly, the word carrying the weight of surrender and paradoxically strength. "Make the call." Dorothy moved quickly but calmly, her years of crisis management with her own family serving her well. She used Marcus's desk phone to call 911, speaking clearly and efficiently about the symptoms she'd observed and the current state of the patient. She provided the building's address, specified the floor and office location, and requested that the EMTs use the service elevator to avoid creating a scene in the main lobby. While they waited for the paramedics, Dorothy called Jessica into the office. The young assistant's perfectly composed expression cracked when she saw her boss's condition, her smartphone finally forgotten as the reality of the situation penetrated her digital bubble. "The investors," Jessica stammered, her voice higher than usual. "Tell them Mr. Thompson had a medical emergency but is receiving excellent care," Dorothy instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Reschedule for next week. If they're the kind of partners worth having, they'll understand that health comes first." The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the office. They quickly assessed Marcus's condition, asking questions about his symptoms, medical history, and current medications. Dorothy provided timeline details about what she'd observed, her clear recollection impressing the lead paramedic. "You may have saved his life," the paramedic told Dorothy as they prepared to transport Marcus to the hospital. "These symptoms, especially the progression you described, could have led to a major cardiac event within hours." Marcus, now connected to a portable EKG monitor and breathing oxygen through a nasal cannula, looked at Dorothy with an expression she'd never seen before. Gone was the commanding CEO, replaced by a man who understood how close he'd come to losing everything that truly mattered. "Dorothy," he said, his voice stronger now that he was receiving proper medical attention. "Thank you." She nodded, her weathered hands clasped in front of her. "You take care of yourself, Mr. Thompson. The company needs you, but more importantly, your family needs you." As the paramedics wheeled Marcus toward the elevator, Dorothy gathered her cleaning supplies and returned to her routine. The executive floor buzzed with whispered conversations and concerned glances, but she moved through it all with the same steady presence she'd maintained for 15 years. She had work to finish, and tomorrow morning, she'd be back at 4:30, ready to do it all again. The hospital diagnosed Marcus with unstable angina and 3 significantly blocked coronary arteries. The cardiologist explained that without immediate intervention, he would have likely suffered a massive heart attack within 24 to 48 hours. The triple bypass surgery was scheduled for the following morning, and the prognosis, thanks to the early detection, was excellent. 3 weeks later, Marcus returned to work on a modified schedule, his recovery ahead of expectations but his perspective permanently altered. The first person he asked to see wasn't Jessica or any of his board members. It was Dorothy. She found him in his office, looking remarkably well despite everything he'd been through. His color was good, his breathing easy, and there was something different in his eyes, a clarity that hadn't been there before. "Dorothy, please sit down," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs across from his desk. She hesitated, unused to being invited to sit in the executive offices, but something in his tone convinced her to accept the offer. "I've been thinking a lot during my recovery," Marcus began, his voice steady and thoughtful. "About priorities, about the people who matter, about the difference between being important and being significant." He paused, studying her face. "You saved my life, not just because you recognized the symptoms, but because you had the courage to speak up when everyone else was too busy or too intimidated to notice what was right in front of them." Dorothy listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "I want to offer you a position," Marcus continued. "Director of Employee Wellness. Your job would be to pay attention to our people the way you paid attention to me, to create programs and policies that ensure everyone in this company, from the executives to the maintenance staff, feels seen and valued." The offer took Dorothy's breath away. A directorship would mean a salary she'd never dreamed of, an office of her own, the kind of respect and recognition she'd never imagined possible. But more than that, it would mean using her gift for seeing people, her lifetime of caring for others, in a way that could help thousands of employees. "I accept," she said simply, and Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in all their years of working in the same building. 6 months later, Dorothy Williams was featured on the cover of Thomson Industries' annual report, not as a human interest story, but as the architect of an employee wellness program that had become a model for corporations nationwide. Her initiatives had reduced sick days by 30%, increased employee satisfaction scores to record highs, and created a culture where people looked out for one another in ways both big and small. The program's cornerstone was something Dorothy called the Dorothy Doctrine, though she tried unsuccessfully to get them to change the name. It was simple: every person in the organization, regardless of their position, was encouraged and empowered to speak up when they noticed something wrong with a colleague's health, safety, or well-being. No concern was too small, no observer too junior to deserve a hearing. Marcus, now fully recovered and working with renewed purpose, often told the story of how his life was saved by someone the corporate world had trained him not to see. He spoke about it at business schools, at leadership conferences, and in interviews with major publications. But his favorite telling was always the quiet conversation he had with new hires during their orientation, when he could look them in the eye and explain that in his company, everyone's voice mattered, and everyone's wisdom was valuable. Dorothy continued to arrive at work at 4:30 in the morning, not because she had to anymore, but because she wanted to. She liked the quiet hours, the sense of stewardship over the space where thousands of people came to earn their living. But now she moved through the building differently, not as an invisible caretaker, but as someone whose observations and insights were not just welcome but essential. The Japanese partnership, rescheduled and eventually signed, brought in even more revenue than originally projected. The investors, impressed by a company that prioritized human welfare over profit margins, became some of Thompson Industries' most enthusiastic advocates in the international market. On the anniversary of Marcus's cardiac event, Dorothy found a gift waiting on her desk, a framed photograph of the executive floor, taken from the perspective of someone pushing a cleaning cart down the hall. The image captured something most people would miss: the way the morning light fell across the marble floors, the reflection of the city skyline in the polished surfaces, the quiet dignity of honest work being done well. The inscription read, "To Dorothy Williams, who sees what others miss and speaks when others stay silent. Thank you for teaching us that wisdom comes in many forms, and heroes work in every corner of our world. With endless gratitude, Marcus Thompson and the entire Thompson Industries family." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Dorothy's daughter called her one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "Mama, I saw the article about you in the business journal. I showed it to my kids, and my youngest asked me if Grandma Dorothy was famous now." There was a pause, and then she continued, "I told her you've always been famous in our family, for all the same reasons you're famous now. For seeing people, for caring about them, and for having the courage to act when it matters most." Dorothy understood then that her story wasn't really about saving one man's life, though that certainly mattered. It was about the quiet heroism of paying attention, of refusing to accept that some people's voices matter more than others, of believing that we all have a responsibility to look out for one another. In a world that often seems determined to divide us by class, race, education, and income, her story was a reminder that our common humanity transcends all those artificial boundaries. Today, when Dorothy walks through the halls of Thompson Industries, she still notices everything: the tired slump of an accountant's shoulders that might indicate depression, the way a manager's hand shakes that could signal anxiety, the labored breathing of an executive who might be ignoring his own health. But now, when she speaks up, people listen. And more importantly, they've learned to notice things themselves, to speak up for their colleagues, to understand that a company is only as strong as the people who care enough to pay attention to each other. The lesson Dorothy taught that day extends far beyond the walls of one office building. It's about the value of experience over credentials, wisdom over authority, and compassion over protocol. It's about understanding that the people we're trained to overlook might be the very ones who hold the keys to our survival. And ultimately, it's about recognizing that in a world where everyone is looking up at those in power, sometimes the most important perspective comes from those who've been watching from the ground level all along.